History and Culture podcasts are a production of PCN, a nonprofit television network. Listeners like you make our programming possible. To learn more about PCN's mission and to support PCN with a donation, visit pcntv.com. This link and others can be found in our show notes. We appreciate your support.
Welcome to PCN's History and Culture podcast. I'm Phil Beckman. This podcast series features interviews exploring Pennsylvania's rich history from the colonial era to industrialization, the Gettysburg Campaign to sports history, and from art to politics and more. Mary Stockwell is the author of Unlikely General, Mad Anthony Wayne, and the Battle for America. Mary, what drew you to Anthony Wayne?
I'm from Northwest Ohio. I live not far from the battlefield, which he called the Battle of the Rapids. We call it the Battle of Fallen Timbers, where he defeated the Indians and the British in 1794. Many things are named after him out here, but I got interested in him as a real person, not just a flashy name or a monument, when I read a letter he wrote to James Madison in 1789, and he described what was going to happen out on the southwestern frontier, and he begged Madison, give me a job, help me help this young United States. When I read it, I said, my God, it was like he was looking into the future. Who was this man, not the madman of legend, but this man who could think and feel and see the future. I read his letters. I was astounded at how beautiful a writer he was. And I said, I've got to bring a new, profound thinking, very complex, but devoted to America, Anthony Wayne to life. So that's how I came to write about him.
So where did Anthony Wayne grow up? What was his origin story?
He was the son of a very wealthy planter, wealthy farmer. He was born outside of Philadelphia on New Year's Day, 1745. He lived in a place called Waynesboro, which was basically his father and mother's farm, and it was also a tannery. So he grew up. His father wanted him to take the next step, become a lawyer, and he wanted to be a soldier. And he played at being a soldier from little on. He had some memory of the French and Indian War happening way to the west, but he had no experience with real warfare beyond absolutely worshiping Caesar, reading everything he could about that Roman general, and believing that someday he was going to also participate in great dramatic wars. Well, where they were, that was far away in his imagination.
Now, he would go on to become a significant general during the Revolutionary War. As the revolutionary movement was growing, was he involved in it at an early date?
Very much so. He was a politician first and a soldier second. He was elected to the Pennsylvania Assembly in 1774. And he was one of the first people in the country who said, we're a de facto republic. We don't have a king. We don't have nobility. We govern ourselves. It's time we have a de jure republic, a republic by law. That was 1774. That shook many people up. It was predating John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, Sam Adams, and he kind of had to retract that, but he was ready to go for the American Revolution. He understood it as a turning point in history, that kind of the old order was going to come to an end, and a new order where the people ruled was coming into being. And he was dedicated to that idea even before any shots were fired in the Revolution.
You mentioned that he aspired for a military career. When was he first commissioned as an officer?
He joins the Continental Army at the start of 1776. He bounds into Washington's camp on Long Island. Races to Washington, I'm here to serve. And one thing Washington remembered was how enthusiastic he was. But like many of these young men who came off to serve, he had no experience. But he was enthusiastic enough, and he had brought his militia he had trained outside of Philadelphia. And Washington placed him in the army that went north to invade Canada, to try to bring Canada in to the American Revolution. That was his first assignment.
What was that experience like for him?
It's amazing when you're reading his letters, because he is filled with, this is so exciting. George Washington is the new Julius Caesar. We're just going to win a few battles. And in the moment he gets on his horse and he starts coming up the Hudson River Valley, he begins to write to his wife. He'll write to her before every battle and after every battle. And he says, my God, I'm terrified of death. I'm dreaming of being a soldier. And now I'm facing my death. I've left you. I've left our 2-year-old son or 4-year-old daughter. And that haunted him all the way up until the first battle began. The first shots were fired at Three Rivers. And the men who were around him said, if he was afraid, we couldn't see it. It was like he just snapped into action. And from that point forward, he had a command and a calm on the battlefield. He could think quickly. And he's credited with leading the retreat of the Americans out of that disaster at Three Rivers. And he was given, his reward was to be made commander of Ticonderoga, a position he absolutely hated because he wanted to get back into the action.
Now, he would get into the action during the Philadelphia campaign. Talk about his role during the Battle of Brandywine.
Uh, the most fascinating thing I discovered about Anthony Wayne was his ability to see contingencies. Before a battle, he would write to Washington, even though they were not close friends. He befriended Washington and he said, this might happen, this will happen. If this happens, we'll do this and this. He'd write to his friends, his fellow generals. He would write to his wife about what he thought was going to happen. He finally gets into the battle at Brandywine, and he had the presence of mind to realize, I don't think the battle is what Washington envisioned. Remember this battle, the British decide they're going to come from west to east, cross Brandywine Creek, and march right into Philadelphia. So Washington appoints Wayne and puts him up on Chad's Ford, kind of a bluff overlooking where Washington is convinced the British, or maybe the Hessians, will be crossing. Wayne goes up there with the artillery, and he kind of sees feints coming his way. And he says, it looks like they're pretending that they're crossing here. He goes, knowing the battlefield already, he goes, I think the British are going far to the north. They're going to swing across the Brandywine Creek. They're going to come down from the north, and they're going to surround us, and we're going to be defeated. And he rode off to Washington, and he said, it's not going the way you think it's going. We have to prepare for an attack from the rear. They're going to swing around Brandywine. And young Nathaniel Greene said the same thing. They were both at Washington's side. Washington said, get back to your positions. It turned out that Wayne was absolutely right. And Wayne was a person who had to stay on the battlefield long enough as everybody fled eastward. He was one of the last people to leave that battlefield. But it was, again, if you're just watching him, he seems so daring. But if you read his letters, he's thought about this, what would happen if something went wrong. And he was always ready to shift his position on the battlefield. And he did it at Brandywine. I think he saved many men.
And he was also commanding troops at the Battle of Paoli. What happened there?
In my opinion, this is where Wayne's imagination gets a little bit ahead of himself. He's convinced still, thinking like Caesar. If Washington would just stand and fight like Caesar did in so many battles, the revolution would be over. Washington gives him a command, and he said, okay, we lost at Brandywine. Now the British are still heading towards Philadelphia. I want you to just kind of bloody their nose. I want you to attack the rear, maybe get their baggage train or something. Well, Wayne goes up in the hills around Paoli, convinced that as the night comes, not only will there be an attack on the baggage train, but he says, I'll begin a battle that will be so stupendous, George Washington will hear me in the rear, and he'll bring his men back, and we'll have this colossal battle at Paoli. He put his men in the hills around Paoli. In the daytime, people came from all over the countryside and told him, the British know you're here. The British know what you're up to. You've got to get out of this. You've got to flee. He didn't flee. He did put a few sentries around. And it turned out that Anthony Wayne was completely wrong. And the people who were warning him were completely right. And the British came in the middle of the night and attacked his position. Again, many of his men died. Washington didn't come to the rescue, but Wayne got his men out of there. It's called the Paoli Massacre, but it was the one time when Wayne truly overthought a situation and decided what was happening before it happened. He becomes progressively more cautious as you watch him as a general from that point forward. And he'll be much more helpful at Germantown. But one thing Washington likes about him is this man can retreat. And we're constantly retreating. And Wayne can lead retreats better than anyone. And he can get himself out of messes he gets himself into. So Washington saw him as quick thinking and didn't want him to be court-martialed, didn't want him to go through military investigations. He said, just drop it. We lost at Paoli. We move on towards Philadelphia.
Now, he was involved in many battles during the course of the war, but one of the key ones was the battle at Stony Point in New York.
Yeah.
Why was that so important for him?
Well, he has an important role at Germantown too. Again, he leads the retreat out of Germantown. And then after that, there's such a lull in fighting. There's going to be a lull in fighting. The army goes into Valley Forge, and they have to wait over the winter of 1777, 1778. This is where I think where Wayne begins to see this as a new kind of war. Julius Caesar has nothing to do with this war. And he realized we just have to keep the army in the field long enough to give the governments of all these states in this nation time to get up and running. He realized George Washington is a new kind of leader in a new kind of war. He's significant at the Battle of Monmouth, which is going to take place in 1777. But then there's like a lull in the fighting in the North. And Wayne gets the idea that maybe, just maybe, if he could do something daring in the middle of the night, he could take a British post, and he chooses Stony Point, which is this post high above the Hudson River on the west side. And he makes this case to Washington: if you could give me enough men and we could go in the middle of the night and I could scale the walls with my men and take that post, it's going to give us a psychological edge. And he knew that a new kind of war and a revolution, you had to look like you could win. You had to look like you were daring. And he proposed to do something like Washington had done at Trenton and Princeton. Let's just shock the British. Well, he plans it all out. His letters that he writes before that battle are stunning, as he realizes he's taking a terrible chance. He's facing death. He again writes to his family and he says, hey, this might be the last time you hear from me because we're going to try something amazing. He takes Stony Point. He doesn't die. His men capture the post. It's a shock. The Americans are going to give it back to the British very soon. But I think it was significant because, again, Wayne realized half the battle in a revolutionary war is not to win spectacular victories on the battlefield, but to keep the army in the field, just keep bloodying the nose of the enemy. You're going to have to wear down the British, King George, the Parliament, until the U.S. can escape and create a true republic.
Now, I want to move forward to the Northwest Indian Wars. And so after the Revolution, he leaves the military, and then George Washington appoints him later in the early 1790s to lead the Legion of the United States. What was going on in the Old Northwest that led to his appointment?
Well, the United States of America wins all the land from the Appalachians to the Mississippi by the Treaty of Paris, which ends the American Revolution. So that's our country. And the policy of the U.S. is to recognize the Indian title, have the Indian tribes sign treaties allowing Americans to settle, and in exchange, they'll be given annuities. We'll pay them not just a lump sum, but we'll pay them year after year forever. A line was drawn down, right down central Ohio, slashing what is now the state of Ohio in two. And the tribes had agreed the U.S. could settle north of it, which is now southern Ohio, and the Indians would stay north of it. But confederations had formed, first under Little Turtle, and then under the great Shawnee Chief Blue Jacket, and with the help of maybe a half a dozen major tribes in the Old Northwest, and with full support from the British in Canada and in Detroit, they're still in Detroit, they decided, no, we're going to tell George Washington that the Ohio River is the boundary between us. You cross that river, George, and you try to settle and increase your country and strengthen your democracy and give opportunity to the people through like this, the land ordinances, which open the land for settlement for $1. We will kill every one of your soldiers. The Indians under Little Turtle had defeated General Harmer. That was 1790. In 1791, they defeated in a terrible battle Arthur St. Clair. About 1,000 Americans had been murdered who had settled south of this dividing line. And the British were behind the scenes telling the Indians, you can win. This map that we drew in Paris is just, it's a draft. Let's keep the whole Western country for us. Well, George Washington was desperate. He had again lost two armies. He knew we could not survive if we were just 13 states clinging to the Atlantic. We had to grow west to strengthen this great republic. And he has to find somebody willing to go out there to raise an army. The army was decimated at the terrible defeat of St. Clair, November 1791, along the Wabash, branch of the Wabash in what is now Western Ohio. Most of the officers were dead. Most of the men were left unburied, slaughtered by the Indians in a surprise attack. And Washington has to find somebody. He said, I have to find somebody who is not a drunkard, who is willing to take this chance, and who will communicate with me and tell me what's going on out there. He makes a list of all his generals still alive from the American Revolution. And he said, my God, they're old, sick, and tired. He takes a chance on Anthony Wayne. He said he's got a lot of flaws. He's enterprising. He's a bit of a spendthrift. He's always worried about his men being properly clothed and fed. He's vain. He wants his men to love him, but he said he's the only one who could take on a task of this magnitude. Wayne is sick. He's tired. He fought at Yorktown, where he was shot before the battle. He led a campaign in Georgia, where he had a complete and total nervous breakdown, physical breakdown. But he still loves the United States of America, and he wants to serve. And he gets this commission, and his job is simple. You must go to Pittsburgh, raise an army, train an army, and if the negotiations that George Washington is doing with the tribes, if he can't open up the Ohio country for settlement, Wayne is going to have to go out into the Ohio country. He will meet somewhere an Indian and probably British army, and he's got to defeat them. And he's got to get them to agree to a treaty allowing Americans to settle north of the Ohio. And if he doesn't do it, we will die in the vine. We'll be a tiny country along the eastern seaboard. And maybe the British and the Indians and the French, Spanish, who knows, will take us. So it's quite a gamble he takes. Wayne knows exactly what's happening. That's another thing that Washington likes about Wayne. He says, I don't have to explain what's going on this continent to this man. He gets it. And he chooses Wayne, and Wayne picks up his command in the spring of 1792.
Now, when Wayne is in Pittsburgh organizing the Legion of the United States, how important is his training regiment for those troops?
It's extremely important. Again, he had never had any experience fighting Indians. He knew them as a little boy, just that it's a war going on, French and Indian War. He actually was almost assassinated by a Creek chief in fighting in Georgia. So he realized my childhood view of what these people are like and my war experience, not understanding them, I can't go out and fight a battle against them if I don't understand them. He read absolutely everything he could on American Indian warfare. And he came to the conclusion, these are the greatest soldiers, the greatest diplomats, and as we would find out, the greatest farmers on the continent. And he decided, what methods I have been trained in aren't going to work out here. It's a different kind of war. And he comes up with a plan. He says, I can train my men to march and to shoot and to follow orders and to ride and be excellent horsemen and soldiers. But there's something more terrible about facing Indian warriors. You don't see them till they strike. They strike, giving no quarter. And you have to be as brave as they are, or you won't win this battle. So he had immense respect for the tribes. And what he did was he began every Sunday, he trained his men in mock battles. He would have half his men dressed up as Indians, half had to be, perfectly polished soldiers. And then they would fight imaginary battles against each other, not with any shot, but just gunpowder. And he said, I've got to get my men ready to be surprised. And I have to teach them the great lesson of warfare out in the Northwest, and that's do not be afraid. Stand your ground. And if we all stick together and we don't flee the battlefield and we fight as fiercely as the enemy, we will win. And he knew he's not just fighting the Shawnee and the Wyandotte, the Miami. He knew he was also fighting British soldiers, and he'd be fighting the Canadian militia. So to him, it was the revolution continuing out west. But that that training his men, one of the men who was watching him was a young Tecumseh, um, who would report back this crazy general having these fake battles. And this is his reputation grew all along the Appalachian Mountain chain. The southern tribes, even before he fought at Fallen Timbers, called him Lightning. Who is this strange man training his men in advance in play battles to defeat us? And that's the reason Little Turtle said, we shouldn't go up against this guy. Let's get a deal. Let's get a deal. Let's sign a treaty because there's something different at work in this man who truly respects us.
Where was Fort Miamis, and what was its role in events that would follow the Legion's movement into Ohio?
And I live about 2 or 3 miles away from it. It's a British fort built illegally on American soil in 1795. It's a few miles south of the mouth of the Maumee River. The Maumee River runs north and it empties into Lake Erie in now the city of Toledo. South of it is a tiny little town called Maumee. That's where the British built Fort Miamis. It had been a French fort. It was now a British fort, and the British said, well, we have to have this because Wayne is coming up here. Maybe he'll attack Detroit. Detroit was supposed to be our fort. They hadn't surrendered it. In actuality, the fort was where they were armed. The British came and were arming all the tribes to continue this fight. And their goal was to make sure that the Americans never crossed the Appalachians, never crossed the Ohio River, that this remained either a wilderness or Canada or part of the British Empire. So Anthony Wayne he's been training his men from 1792. Finally, in 1793, he makes it all the way up, maybe 100 miles from Cincinnati. He builds Fort Greenville. He winters over there in 1793, 1794. And when George Washington hears that the British have, sometime in 1794, put this illegal fort, Fort Miamis, up on the Maumee River, that they're arming the Indians, telling them to keep fighting, he finally, through Knox, sends the orders to Wayne, start marching. Don't go towards the Miami country. Don't march up towards Kikiunga, which is now Fort Wayne. Instead, go up the Maumee and head for that fort. And Washington and Knox tell Wayne, somewhere between where you are at Fort Greenville and Fort Miamis, you're going to be surprised. The Indians are going to attack. The British will be with them, Canadian militia will be with them, and you have to win this battle and get those defeated tribes to the negotiating table. You've got to open up the West or we're lost. And Wayne begins his march. He's marching towards the British fort at Fort Miami. He keeps sending out runners. We don't have to fight. We don't have to do this. He's still in the back of his mind after all his training, worried, I don't think my men are going to be able to defeat these people. They're just too great as warriors. He also was suffering. He was deathly sick. He was depressed. He had to have his legs wrapped with bandages. A young William Henry Harrison was a lieutenant, and Harrison had been trained as a doctor, and he would wrap Wayne up and they would lift him on his horse in immense pain, always out of sight of the soldiers, so they didn't know how much he was suffering. But up he comes, coming this way, until he's only about 10 miles from the fort. And it's now August the 19th, 1794, and they know the battle will probably be the next day. They're only 10 miles from the British fort.
So this would become the Battle of Fallen Timbers. Why was that? How did the battle itself unfold? Where were the positions of the American troops versus the Native American peoples, and what happened?
The night before the battle, you can go to a place called Farnsworth Park. If you ever come to Ohio, it's one of the great metro parks of the city of Toledo. Wayne asked his men, how do we march? No one would speak, but it was young Lieutenant William Henry Harrison takes out a huge oak leaf and he lays down the order of the battle. He said, we are going to march as you taught us in 4 columns. We're going to go up along the western side of the Maumee River. And a point will come if guns ring out, we will do what you taught us. We will form 2 lines facing the enemy. And as that enemy moves, we'll keep turning so that they can't surround us. the battle was delayed because when they woke up on the morning of August the 20th, and they were going to begin, the Americans were going to begin about their 10-mile march up to the British fort. It had rained overnight, so the drums didn't work. So Wayne takes Harrison, puts a green sash around him, and he says, "You're going to have to ride back and forth between the battle lines to give the commands." They're coming north, they're marching north, just at a place where you can see it today. It's the southern tip of Sidecut Park, right along the Maumee River. They stopped on a bluff, and it was so gorgeous. There were the rapids of the river. Everybody stopped and stared at the sheer beauty of it. They didn't know that the 6, 7 major Indian nations, top warriors, Blue Jacket, a young Tecumseh was there, Little Turtle was there, Canadian militia out on the American left, a few British soldiers, the Wyandot were there, that they had placed themselves in rows behind fallen timbers, fallen trees that had fallen in a tornado. And they were on a bluff that kind of went from west, and it was a bluff down to the river and tall grass. And bam, shots rang out. The Indians shot at the Americans. And the very first thing the Americans at the front of the line did was turn and run. They turned and they ran. They were so terrified. And Wayne had threatened them, "If you run from the battlefield, I will gun you down." People kind of calmed down. The Americans calmed down. They turned and they fought. And they pushed the Indians back on their right, up the center. And finally, after only an hour of fighting, the Indians said, "We have to get out of here. We have to flee." They fled the battlefield. And then Wayne brought up the rest of his army, and he brought up Kentucky militia, whom he did not like, but he used them, and they began to swing out to his left. They were about to completely and totally surround the Indians. They fled. They fled. The tribes, the ones who could survive, ran about 3 or 4 miles as fast as they could up what is now the River Road, and they went to that British fort. And they come, knocking on those gates, "Let us in, let us in. We lost this battle. You have promoted and encouraged us to fight." And the British closed the gates in their face and said, we don't know who you are." And the very next day, after Wayne had buried this dead, he goes up to that fort with a young William Henry Harrison at his side. It's a well defended fort. There's absolutely no way he could take it. But to show his total disrespect and how his hatred of the British, he got down off his horse. He went along the creek that surrounded, like the moat, picked up a little bit in his hand, drank the water and spit it out, got back on his horse. That was the Battle of Fallen Timbers. He wasn't certain he had won. He didn't think he had won until the following February, when Blue Jacket, the great Shawnee chief, finally came in to the Fort Greenville and said, "It's over. It's over. We'll sign that treaty. It will be called the Treaty of Greenville. The British are still telling us to keep fighting for the Ohio River. Too many are dead, women and children suffering." And Wayne writes a description of this battle, sends it back to Philadelphia. It goes into the newspapers, and he made this one comment. He was such a brilliant writer. "They fought in fallen timbers. They fought in fallen timbers." So the battle, he always called the Battle of the Rapids. In Philadelphia, they call it the Battle of Fallen Timbers. So that's how we get it. And it turned out to be a victory for America. And the Treaty of Greenville will be signed a year later, and the southern part of Ohio is open for settlement.
We've been speaking with Mary Stockwell. She is the author of Unlikely General, Mad Anthony Wayne and the Battle for America. Mary, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for inviting me, and have a wonderful time. And wish I could be there in Pennsylvania with all you guys.
Listeners like you make PCN programming possible. Full episodes of PCN's history and culture content, like the interview you just heard, are available to stream with the PCN Select app. Explore other documentary programs, event coverage, and a lot more. To learn more about PCN's mission and to support PCN with a donation, visit PCNTV.com. This link and others can be found in our show notes. We appreciate your support.